Hello learners of English, welcome to the channel. This channel is for Russian speakers who want to improve their English skills. Have you ever asked yourself, do I really need a British accent? Do I really need an American accent? Do I need to get rid of my Russian accent? Well, this video is going to be about me ranting about why you do not need to get rid of your Russian accent, or you do not need to reduce your accent. So let's speak about this topic. A lot of people would say you need to speak English without an accent, in particular Russians, and there is a lot of, I would say, nasty competition between Russians as to who can have the most pure, least Russian accent. And I think this is tragic. This should not be happening because first and foremost, the Russian accent is a really cool accent. You should not be trying to get rid of this awesome accent. It sounds so interesting. It sounds so sexy. It sounds so intriguing and maybe even evil, but in a cool way, like in a James Bond villain kind of a way. It is so interesting. I'm not saying that you should not speak clearly. You need to speak English in a clear way. But why would you want to get rid of your Russian accent? What is the problem with this? Well, I have noticed ever since I moved to Russia a few years ago. I am from London, if you don't know me. I have noticed that Russia, unfortunately, has this kind of sense of insecurity about its national identity. I have talked about this in a previous video where I talked about how I see the word Евро everywhere in Russia. Евро meaning Europe or European. For instance, I've seen the word Евроремонт, Евробетон, Евромед, Евросеть, Евro everything. And I believe this sense of national or cultural insecurity stems from the era of Peter the Great. Peter the Great, of course, he founded St. Petersburg and he tried to make Russia a very European country. Now, I'm not saying that Peter the Great was a bad leader of Russia. Of course, he did many brilliant things, and St. Petersburg is a wonderful city. It's a spectacular city. But what he did do, unfortunately, was instill this sense of insecurity in Russia's cultural collective identity. And this is something that Russians need to be aware of. I'm saying, as an English person, that being Russian is such a cool thing. You do not need to be ashamed about being Russian. If you are worried about Russophobic people, in other words, people who hate Russia and Russians, then you need to just relax and not worry about these people, and you need to buy yourself a can of pepper spray in case some crazy person wants to attack you for being Russian. No person from any nation should ever feel ashamed of their national identity. It is not something that you choose. It is not something that you can control. You were born where you were born, and you need to embrace your national identity. There is nothing to be ashamed of. Now, as a language teacher, an English language teacher here in Russia, well, I'm not a teacher technically, I'm more of a language tutor, but that's another story. As someone who works in teaching people English or helping people learn English, I have noticed that there are many Russian teachers who want to help native Russian speakers reduce their Russian accent when they are speaking English. This makes me so sad. I really don't want to see this anymore. I have heard many Russians use the word village when describing people. I get the impression that many Russian people think that they sound uneducated. They sound like people from a small village when they are speaking in English with their native accent. Firstly, I need to say there's nothing wrong with coming from a small village. And secondly, the Russian accent inherently sounds very educated because Russia is known stereotypically to be a very intellectual nation. So don't worry about sounding like you are intellectually inferior if you have a Russian accent. The one thing I will say is that in English, we have some vowels that sound much different to Russian vowels. For instance, the words walk and work. There you have to be careful because in Russian, you don't have the vowel that sounds like You don't have that sound in Russian. So that's one thing you need to pay attention to. You need to practice saying the vowel sound but that doesn't mean that you have to change your accent. It doesn't mean that you have to get an artificial British accent. I have met a Russian English teacher. I will not mention his or her name, but this English teacher from Russia, her accent is scarily good. She sounds almost like a native British English speaker, but you can still sense, as a native speaker of English, you can still sense that there is something not quite right. There is something that she is hiding, even though her accent is really, really good. And to me, this is just creepy. It makes me scared almost. It's kind of like looking at an extreme version of plastic surgery. Now, a lot of people like plastic surgery. Personally, it's not my cup of tea, but there is a limit. You can't completely change who you are with plastic surgery. And the same thing goes for your accent. And this teacher, I need to say, hats off to her. She's really done an amazing job of perfectly imitating, perfectly copying a northern British English accent. Maybe not northern, but it is a more regional accent in the UK. She has done an amazing job of copying this accent, but you can still sense that it is not 100% perfect. And it is just kind of creepy. It is not natural. It is not something that is pleasant. It's kind of almost neurotic. Another thing I need to mention is, let's say theoretically you could perfectly copy a British accent. But just imagine if you spoke with a perfect British accent, but you did not use the correct idioms. You made grammatical mistakes every now and then, and you were always searching for words. It would just sound really strange. You would need to have such an amazing knowledge of English, native knowledge of English, in order to really pull off a perfect British accent. Otherwise, you would just sound like an idiot. For me, I am someone I'm a white person, I live in Russia, and I look like maybe I could be Russian. And when I speak to some people in Russia, they immediately assume that I am Russian. And I speak pretty good Russian. It's far from perfect, but it's pretty good. I can have a good conversation in Russian. And when I speak, sometimes people think that I'm a bit of an idiot because I sometimes take a few seconds to think about how to structure a sentence. Now, what I have done is I have made my English accent even more prominent when I'm speaking Russian, so that people immediately understand that I am not a native Russian speaker, and that they understand that I am not such a big idiot. Well, I'm not the smartest person on the planet, but I don't want to sound like an idiot. So what I do is I actually make my British accent sound a little bit stronger when I'm speaking Russian. I'm not saying that I can perfectly copy a Russian accent. There's no way I could do that. I am not a native Russian speaker. I can't do that. So you have to take that into account. Let's say if you had an amazing talent at copying accents, you need to be careful that you don't sound like an idiot if you speak English incorrectly or slightly incorrectly. I kind of sometimes wish that I were a black person in Russia, because black people, they are very clearly not from Russia. And when people speak to them, they already know I am not speaking to a native Russian speaker. And this way they can see that this person is already very intelligent because they have learnt the Russian language to a very high standard. They do not immediately assume that a black person is Russian. So it would be quite cool to be a black person in Russia. I remember once I was going to take a medical exam to get my driving license here in Russia, and I went into the doctor's office and she said something in Russian, of course. We did not speak in English. We spoke in Russian. And she said, "Присаживайтесь, have a seat." And then she said something really quickly. I think she said something like, "Wait for me in the corridor," like "Ждите меня в коридоре," something like that. But she said it really quickly and really, she mumbled, she swallowed her words. And I said, "Повторите, пожалуйста, я вас не расслышал." Excuse me, could you repeat what you said? I didn't quite hear you. And she said, "Вы не слышите, что ли? You can't hear me," something. So this doctor assumes that I was Russian, and she assumed that I was just being an idiot or a deaf person. So before you decide to fork out several $100s or even $1,000 on a accent reduction course in English, you need to think to yourself, why do I need to reduce my Russian accent when speaking English? What is the point of doing so? The only reasons, in my point of view, the only reasons as to why you would want to really reduce your Russian accent when speaking in English is because, number one, you want to be an actor in a film and you want to play the role of a British character or an American character. And number two, you want to be a super spy who can copy the English accent perfectly. You basically want to be like a Russian James Bond. But most people do not fit into those two categories. So I would say you should find better things to do with your time. You should focus on learning more words, vocabulary in English. And most importantly, you should spend as much time as possible reading, listening to English language content. Reducing your accent should not be your priority if you are learning any foreign language. It's just not a very important thing. One final thing I need to mention is that if you are under the age of 12 or 11, I will say that it is much easier for you to adopt a very native accent when learning a foreign language. Maybe this is because your facial muscles are much more malleable. Malleable means that you can change them much more. And the older you get, the more your facial muscles, I would say, calcify. They become stiffer. It becomes much harder to change your facial muscles the older you get. There is a famous famous YouTuber, excuse me. He's famous in Russia. His name is Justice Walker, and he is an American guy who moved to Russia when he was 11, and he speaks Russian like a native Russian speaker. It is absolutely scary how good his Russian is, but he moved to Russia at just the perfect time when he was 11, and I believe he went to a Russian school, so he completely adopted the native Russian accent. But if you are not 11, which I suspect most of you are much older than the age of 11, then there is no point in trying to achieve this perfect British or American accent. It is just not realistic, and it is not a good use of your time. So if you enjoyed this video, or if you have something to share with me, please send me a message in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you, and please press the like and subscribe button if you have not done so already. So thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again in a future video, and bye for now.